The clay feels cold in the scholar's hands, not the polished cold of an object arranged under museum lights, not the clean chill of glass or stone on public display. This is another kind of cold. Basement vault cold. Storage facility cold. The kind that passes through cotton gloves, through skin, through the thin distance between present touch and ancient matter, until it seems to settle somewhere deeper. Somewhere bone remembers before language does. British Museum storage, early 20th century. A catalog number, BM78941, 8 inches of baked earth. A broken surface crossed by chips and cracks, its upper corner missing its face, impressed with wedge-shaped marks no one had heard aloud in 4,000 years. The tablet is incomplete. It arrives to us already wounded. Part of it is gone. Part of it has survived. And yet enough remains. Enough of the surface. Enough of the signs. Enough of the careful pressure once made by a Babylonian scribe in the Kassite period around 1646 BC. To preserve something that still unsettles anyone who reads it closely enough. Because this tablet does not tell the story many later civilizations would tell, it does not say humanity's first mistake was eating forbidden fruit. It does not begin with theft of fire. It does not linger over a tower rising toward heaven. It does not explain catastrophe as the punishment for pride in the form we now most easily recognize. What it preserves is stranger than that, simpler than that, and because it is simpler, it is in some ways harder to dismiss. According to BM 78941 and the related fragments that accompany it, humanity's first mistake was not that we disobeyed, it was that we multiplied. We filled the land, we built cities, we made noise, we lived at scale. We became numerous enough, active enough, present enough that the world itself seemed to ring with us. And in that ringing and that sound of successful human life, the gods lost sleep. That was the crime. If you are hearing this late at night, somewhere far from where these tablets were first buried, there is something fitting in that, something almost exact. These are records about noise listened to in darkness. These are records about disturbed sleep, heard in the quiet hours when even a small sound can seem larger than it is. If you feel like it, leave a brief note with where you're listening from and what hour the night has reached there. Not to interrupt the thought, only to place yourself inside it, because the text itself lives inside that tension. The tablet belongs to what we now call the Atrahasis epic. The name means exceedingly wise, referring to the human figure at its center. But wisdom in these tablets is not protection. Wisdom does not exempt humanity from what follows. The story is not about how wisdom saves us from suffering. It is about how even wisdom cannot protect a species from being judged inconvenient by those who made it. And the beginning is crucial. The beginning is not blessing. The beginning is not love. The beginning is not a God deciding out of delight to make beings in his image and walk among them. The beginning is administrative, practical, unadorned. The gods were tired. The tablets state it plainly. Before humanity, the gods themselves labored. They dug the river channels. They carried the burdens. They maintained the irrigation systems that would one day sustain the cities of Sumer. They worked the earth. They bore the loads. And eventually the younger gods, the ones tasked with the labor, reached a limit and refused to continue. The Atrahasis text lingers on that refusal in ways that feel almost documentary. The younger gods burn their tools. They march by night to the house of Enlil, king of the gods. They surround his dwelling. They do not come one by one with complaints. They come together in force as workers whose patience has ended. Our work was heavy, they say. The distress was much. There is no philosophical abstraction in that, no cosmic poetry softening it. It is a labor dispute, a revolt, a workload crisis at the level of heaven. And when Enlil discovers his laborers in open rebellion, he does not simply annihilate them. He convenes a council. That detail matters. It matters because it gives the whole narrative its tone. These are not gods acting in a sudden burst of rage. These are gods discussing policy, assessing options, solving a problem. And the solution they arrive at is humanity. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, proposes something new, not another god, but a creature capable of labor. A being intelligent enough to perform work, but subordinate enough to accept it. A servant species. A replacement workforce. Something that can carry the burden the gods no longer wish to carry themselves. The word used is Lulu primitive man, fashioned not as companion, not as beloved child, but as function. Humans are made because labor must be transferred, because divine rest has become more important than divine work. And then the text becomes more disturbing still. Creation requires sacrifice. A god must die. The tablets name him We'ila, also called Geshtu-e, a god of intelligence and understanding. He is killed. His flesh and blood are mixed with clay. The mother goddess Nantu, also called Ninhursag, takes this mixture and shapes the first humans from it. 7 males, 7 females, not breathed into being as pure image, not spoken into life as holy reflection, pressed together from matter and slaughter. The gods spit on the clay. The birth goddesses are summoned. The process unfolds with the controlled precision of manufacture. Bodies formed, gestation observed, birth cries recorded. This is not creation as gift. This is creation as solution. We are made because the gods are tired. The Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, confirms the same logic in a different voice. After Marduk defeats Tiamat and arranges the world from her body, he proposes the making of humanity. Why? So that the service of the gods may be transferred, so that they might be at ease. That phrase repeats like a quiet verdict, that they might be at ease. Not that we might flourish, not that we might grow in wisdom, not that we might become worthy of eternity. We are made so that they might rest. Even the older Sumerian text, Enki and Ninmah, circles the same idea from another angle. There, in a strange and nearly unsettling episode, the goddess Ninmah fashions flawed human beings, a blind man, a paralyzed man, a barren woman, a man who cannot control his own body. And Enki, rather than rejecting them, assigns each a place, a function, a use. Even imperfection can be managed into utility. Even damaged beings can still be fitted into the machinery of service. That is the frame. That is the world these tablets preserve. Human beings were made to work. We were made to support divine ease. We were made because labor had to go somewhere, and the gods decided it should go downward. And at first it worked. Of course it worked. That is what makes the story so difficult. We did what we were made to do. We worked, we built, we reproduced, we organized, we developed cities, agriculture, ritual, trade, all the interlocking systems that make civilization possible. We succeeded in the task assigned to us. The machine functioned. The design proved effective. And then the consequence of that effectiveness emerged. The Atrahasis tablets describe the shift with terrifying simplicity. Time passes. The land expands. The peoples multiply. Humanity becomes numerous enough that the earth itself is said to bellow like a bull. That word matters. Bellowing, uproar, clamor, not rebellion, not blasphemy, not deliberate defiance. Sound, the sound of human life at scale. Markets, construction, animals, festivals, arguments, births, workshops, streets, children, temples, brewing yards, hammers, voices, the ambient roar of a species succeeding in the open air, and Enlil hears it. The noise of mankind has become too much for me, he says. I lose sleep because of their uproar. That is the line the clay preserves. That is the line that still sits cool and patient in museum darkness. Humanity's first mistake was not moral failure in the form later traditions preferred. It was biological success. It was thriving too well at the very work we had been designed to perform. We solved the gods' labor problem, and in solving it, we became a different problem. That is where the tablets begin to turn, slowly, quietly, inevitably, and once they turn, they never really turn back. To understand why the noise mattered, we have to slow down. We have to remain with the word longer than modern instinct wants to, because it is easy to hear that complaint. The noise of mankind has become too much for me, and reduce it to metaphor or convenience, or a primitive attempt to explain disaster. But the cuneiform record insists on returning to it, again and again, in slightly different forms, in different words carrying different shades of the same unease. Uproar, tumult, clamor, disturbance. Not one sound. A condition, an atmosphere, an acoustic state in which human presence has become too dense to ignore. The Mesopotamian imagination did not separate order from environment as neatly as later thought sometimes does. The cosmos was not simply there passively existing in stable form. It had to be maintained, balanced, held in relation. The Sumerians used the concept of me-divine powers, structuring principles, foundational attributes of civilization and reality. Kingship music, justice, erotic life, warfare, craftsmanship, ritual office, rule itself. These were not abstractions. They were operative forces, transferable, stealable, vulnerable. Reality held together because these powers remained in right relation, and when they did not, order thinned. This matters because in that framework, sound is not innocent. Sound can be ritual. Sound can be sanctioned. Sound can be ordered, measured, proper. Temples were not silent places. Ceremonies used music, chant, bells, recitation. Festivals were loud. Processions were loud. Sacred space could resound with noise and still remain inside the architecture of order. But unauthorized noise was something else. Uncontained noise. Civic noise. The constant roar of ordinary life, no longer held within ritual form. The word Huber appears in related contexts to describe underworld waters, chaotic tumult, battle noise, the rushing violence of what resists containment. The same language used for primordial disorder appears near the language used for human civilization when it grows too dense. That is what makes the Atrahasis complaint so unsettling. It suggests that the gods did not hear our cities as evidence of successful service. They began to hear them as an acoustic resemblance to chaos. Not because we meant rebellion, because civilization itself, when numerous enough, sounded too much like the thing the gods had once fought to suppress. This is why the text is so difficult to comfort away. Humanity is not accused of refusing labor. We are not accused of laziness, ingratitude, or sacrilege. We are accused, if that word even applies, of generating conditions incompatible with divine rest. The temple compounds of Mesopotamia embodied the opposite of those conditions. Thick mud brick walls, elevated chambers, the gods' residence situated apart, above, buffered from the density below. The sacred upper space as place of repose, of maintained presence, of divine settlement. Rest mattered there. Rest was not casual, it was structural. The god at rest signified the world in order. So when Enlil loses sleep, this is not merely irritation. It is presented as system strain, as an operational disturbance in the relation between divine stillness and human activity. The cities below have become too loud for the chambers above. Archaeology makes the image even more vivid. Uruk, Nippur, Shurupak, dense housing, narrow streets, workshops, kilns, breweries, animals moving through passageways, river traffic, trade, prayer, quarrel, celebration. No one who has walked through a tightly packed city, ancient or modern, needs that translated into abstraction. Civilization has a sound. It always has. And when enough bodies gather long enough in one place, that sound begins to live in the air like weather. The tablets preserve the moment when the gods decide that weather has become intolerable. The pattern once seen is difficult to unsee. The gods create humans. Humans labor. Humans multiply. Humans build. Humans make the world ring with habitation. The gods are pleased for a while. Then the same turning arrives, the same return, the same circle. The people have become too many. The land bellows. The god cannot sleep. The council must convene again. That rhythm is one of the most important features of the narrative, because this is not a story of a single error followed by a single punishment. It is cyclical, recursive. Humanity grows, becomes noisy, is reduced, recovers, grows noisy again. The problem is not solved once. It returns because the design that produced the problem remains in place. And that is where Enki's role becomes impossible to ignore. Enlil wants reduction, quiet, fewer voices, less presence, less human density. Enki, who helped make humanity in the first place, repeatedly acts to preserve us. Not openly, not in full defiance, but by indirection, by warnings, by cleverness, by the kind of technical obedience that avoids saying the forbidden thing directly while making sure the right ears hear it anyway. This is not a simple division between a cruel god and a kind one. It is more complicated than that. Enki protects humanity, yes, but he also created the design that made catastrophe possible. He saves humans, but not all humans. He grants wisdom, but withholds eternity. He preserves the species, yet maintains the boundaries that keep the species manageable. His protection has limits, and those limits appear most clearly in another story that runs parallel to Atrahasis, like a narrow current alongside a wider river, the tale of Adapa. Adapa is no ordinary man. He is king of Eridu, oldest of cities in Sumerian memory, and Enki grants him exceptional wisdom, intelligence, understanding, a widened ear for the destinies of the land. But the text is careful, almost severe, in the way it states what Enki does not grant him. He gave him wisdom, he did not give him eternal life. That phrase sits there like a deliberate absence, and the longer one stays with these myths, the more deliberate it feels. Humanity may be made capable. Humanity may be made skillful. Humanity may even be allowed to approach godlike understanding in small, controlled ways. But mortality is kept in reserve as a boundary not to be crossed. Why? Because wisdom alone is not the problem. Population is the problem. Sound is the problem. Accumulation is the problem. And a species that could become immortal, even in small numbers, would eventually become numerous through duration alone. Mortality limits buildup. Death keeps human presence from becoming permanent in aggregate. Adapa does not yet know that. The story has not reached that point yet. But Atrahasis already hints at it. Every attempt to reduce population, every effort to make humanity quieter, assumes the same underlying fear. Left unchecked, humans do not remain few. Intelligence adapts, life reproduces, settlements expand, recovery follows reduction. That is what makes the divine displeasure feel less like reaction and more like the discovery of a design flaw. The gods created beings capable of labor, but labor at scale generates settlement, and settlement generates density, and density generates noise, and noise, once great enough, resembles chaos in the ears of those above. We were made to solve a problem, but the solution carried within it the shape of another problem. The tablets circle that thought from multiple directions because it is central and because it is difficult. They do not rush past it. They return and return again. Humans were created for service. Humans served well. Humans became too many. The gods could not sleep. And once a god like Enlil is kept from rest, the texts imply what follows is not random. It is measured, sequential, deliberate. The first intervention comes not as flood, not yet. Flood is later. Flood is what happens when lesser methods fail. The earlier attempts are narrower, more calibrated, almost managerial in their scale. The goal is not extinction. The goal is reduction. Humanity must be made smaller, quieter, less. The language used in the tablets is chilling precisely because it is so restrained. The death god is to be set upon the land. Later, rain is withheld, then harvest, then food itself. Each intervention seeks the same end by a different path. Fewer bodies, fewer voices, less pressure rising from below into the chambers of divine rest. And after each intervention, the same hidden struggle reappears. Enlil proposes, the council approves, the force is deployed, and Enki undermines it just enough, not enough to restore humanity to safety, just enough to preserve continuity. That is the pattern. That is the loop. And loops matter in these texts. They are not inefficiency, they are revelation. They show that the problem is not any one disaster. The problem is the recurrence itself. The gods are not dealing with a single act of rebellion. They are dealing with the species that keeps doing what it was made to do. Work, build, recover, multiply, return. And so the narrative returns as well, back to the same complaint, back to the same counsel, back to the same unbearable sound. The land bellows again. The god loses sleep again. Humanity succeeds again at being human. The architecture of divine displeasure is not built on sin in the way later traditions will often frame it. It is built on repetition, on the fact that we do not stop. And the gods, it seems, did not know what to do with a species that would not stop except by dying. The first intervention is introduced with almost frightening calm, not with thunder, not with theatrical anger, not with a divine curse hurled from heaven in a moment of emotional rupture. The tablets give it to us as decision, a line spoken in counsel, a measure to be implemented. Let the death god work his devastation. That is the phrasing, or near enough to it across the surviving versions. Devastation is not random here. It is not unstructured chaos. It is something let loose for a purpose, something tasked, a force assigned. Humanity is to be reduced. The damaged state of the tablets keeps some details from us. There are sections where the clay breaks, where the lines thin into silence. But enough remains to sketch the pattern. Disease, suffering, bodies lying out in the streets, populations diminished. The land quieting not because anyone agreed to be quieter, but because too many mouths had closed at once. This is one of the most chilling features of the Atrahasis tradition. Quiet is achieved not through harmony, not through restraint learned in time, but through death. The gods want less sound, and one way to get less sound is to reduce the number of living bodies able to produce it. The tablets suggest the measure initially works, the people diminish, the noise falls, divine rest is restored, or partially restored, but only partially, only for a while. Because human life, once not wholly erased, does what it has been shaped to do. It continues. The survivors remain intelligent. They remain fertile. They rebuild. They recover. Generations pass. The land fills again, and the same complaint rises once more. The people have multiplied. The noise has returned. Enlil cannot sleep. That repetition is essential. It is not decorative. It is the argument. The first devastation was not enough because it addressed effect, not cause. It lowered the volume, but left the source intact. So the second intervention follows. This time the tablets are clearer. Enlil orders drought. The storm god Adad is to withhold rain. The rivers are not to rise. Springs are not to bring water from the deep. The system of fertility on which Mesopotamian life depends is not merely interrupted. It is administratively constricted. Water is turned into policy, and the text gives the drought a terrible slowness. It does not arrive all at once. It unfolds by years. First diminished yields, then parched land, then faces altered by hunger, then desperation, then collapse. By the 6th year, the tablets speak in lines so stark they almost resist narration. Children prepared for food, daughters prepared for food, society consuming itself because the heavens have gone dry. It is impossible to mistake the intention. This is not symbolic lack. It is stage scarcity severe enough to make ordinary life impossible. The cities once loud become quieter through exhaustion, migration, starvation, and death. Again, the measure should have worked. Again, it does not fully work. Because Enki intervenes, he cannot openly oppose Enlil's decree, so he moves indirectly. He instructs the human leader Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise one, to direct worship toward Adad alone. Forget the others for now. Appeal to the specific god whose function has been withheld. Offer to him. Honor him. Call him back into relation with the people. And Adad relents. Rain falls. Rain. The drought breaks. Crops rise again. Humanity recovers again. Listen to the circularity of it. The gods reduce. Enki preserves. Humanity returns. Enlil is disturbed again. The same wheel keeps turning. And by the time the third intervention comes, the text implies that Enlil has learned from the previous failures. Drought left a single point of leverage. Adad could be moved, water could be restored. So now the effort becomes broader, more coordinated. Not one pressure point, but many. The third intervention is famine, but famine in a more total sense than drought alone. Field and oven alike are affected. Plant life is suppressed. Grain does not sprout. Bread does not emerge. The productive systems of land are denied from multiple directions at once. This is important because it reveals something about divine thinking in the text. The gods are not merely expressing displeasure. They are refining strategy, adjusting method, learning how to manage the human problem more effectively. And the human problem is still not moral rebellion. It is continued survival. That is why the language remains so disturbing. Disease, drought, famine. These are not presented first as punishments for wickedness. They are instruments of population control. Human life must be made fewer. Human sound must be reduced. Quiet must be restored. Again, the famine works for a while. Again, people weaken. Again, the noise stills. And again, Enki preserves a path through catastrophe. If crops fail on land, then fish may still be taken from river and sea. Enki's domain is water. Where agricultural systems are blocked, he opens another form of sustenance. Humanity survives on what remains available through him. Enough survive. Enough endure. Enough live to begin the cycle again. And Enlil, in the surviving lines, sounds not merely angry now, but exhausted, frustrated. The interventions do not hold. Each one creates temporary quiet. None create permanent resolution. This is the point where the narrative begins to darken towards something final. Because the pattern has become undeniable. As long as humans remain human, intelligent, reproductive, adaptive reduction alone will not solve the issue. Any population not entirely erased will eventually recover. Any quiet bought through death will eventually end in renewed noise. That is what makes the later flood feel, in the logic of the text, less like abrupt madness and more like escalation. Before the flood, though, another question begins to surface. One that will matter later, and that the myth of Adapa brings into sharper focus. What if humanity's deepest threat to divine order is not merely number, but the possibility that number and duration might one day combine? Adapa is exceptional, and his exception matters because it exposes the boundary. Enki gives him understanding so great that even Anu in heaven will later marvel at what has been disclosed to impure mankind. But Enki withholds eternal life. That withholding is not accidental, it is structural. A mortal species that multiplies is dangerous enough from the perspective of divine rest. An immortal species that multiplies even slowly would eventually create pressure beyond any manageable threshold. Mortality is not simply punishment in these myths, it is containment. The Atrahasis cycles prepare us to understand that. Every reduction assumes that unchecked human accumulation is intolerable. Death is the only continuous mechanism that keeps accumulation from becoming absolute. Remove death, and the noise problem becomes permanent. So when later texts insist that Adapa could be wise but not deathless, they are extending the same logic from the population level down into the structure of each human life. We may know much, we may serve well, we may build, but we may not last. Because if we lasted and multiplied, and remembered and continued, then the old condition would return. The land would fill, the cities would roar, the gods would lose sleep again. All of that is already latent in the pre-flood interventions. Disease is not random. Drought is not random. Famine is not random. They are rehearsals, tests, attempts to solve through reduction what cannot be solved so long as the design remains unchanged. And because the design remains unchanged, the solutions fail. That is what the tablets preserve with such unnerving patience. Not one catastrophe, but a series of corrections. Not one divine judgment, but repeated efforts to tune humanity back down to an acceptable volume. Each time we grow, each time we are cut back, each time enough survive, each time the sound rises again. The wheel turns, the council gathers, the complaint is restated, the land bellows, the god is disturbed, sleep becomes impossible. The world is prepared once more for another intervention. And finally, after plague, after drought, after famine, after survival, after return, after repeated evidence that humanity will always recover unless wholly erased, the gods arrive at the measure that will not merely reduce. It will reset. It will drown the cities. It will erase the sound itself. And when that proposal comes, Enki will face a different problem. Not how to mitigate another reduction, but how to save the species from extinction without openly defying the assembly that has decided extinction is now the only path left. The warning comes indirectly. That detail matters, and the tablets linger over it because it reveals both the danger and the cunning of the moment. Enki cannot simply stand before Atrahasis and say what is coming. The divine council has resolved on destruction. Open defiance would be defiance. So Enki chooses a narrower path. He speaks to the wall, or rather he speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, knowing perfectly well that the man behind it is listening. Wall, wall, the text says. Reed, wall, reed, wall. Hear me. Pay attention. Destroy your house. Build a boat. Save life. It is one of the oldest legal fictions in literature. One of the oldest acts of survival through technicality. Enki warns the structure, not the man. He preserves deniability while ensuring understanding. It is a gesture of protection, yes, but also a gesture that shows the limits of that protection. He will save humanity, but not openly. He will save humanity, but not all humanity. He will save a line, a seed, a remnant. Enough for continuity, not enough to prevent silence. The instructions that follow are practical, almost engineering notes. Build a proper vessel. Roof it over above and below. Seal it. Load into it life seed grain, family animals. Bring what is necessary for continuation. Conceal what you are doing. Do not announce the truth. This secrecy is one of the cruelest elements in the narrative. Atrahasis' neighbors help him. They assist in the construction. They are told in some versions that another explanation accounts for the work. A granary, a great structure of some other kind. The people who will soon drown help prepare the vessel that will not carry them. The text never pauses long to mourn that irony. It simply preserves it, quietly, which makes it worse. The boat is completed in 7 days. That number, like so many numbers in Mesopotamian literature, is not only arithmetic. It has rhythm, completeness, finality, enough time to act, but not enough time for a civilization to escape, enough time for obedience, not enough time for rescue on a human scale. Then dawn comes, and with it, the beginning. A black cloud rises on the horizon. A dad thunders within it. The herald gods move ahead of the storm. Torches lift. Glare spreads over the land. Light changes. The sky closes. The weather ceases to be weather and becomes implementation. This is not rain as nourishment. It is rain as weapon. Water comes from above and below. The deep opens. The heavens open. The ordered boundaries separating elements collapse into one another. The text is careful about the violence of it. For 6 days and 7 nights, storm and flood sweep the land. Houses disappear. Cult centers vanish. Cities are submerged. Human beings cling panic, drown. The world that had once become too loud becomes first chaotic in another register, then utterly still. And the gods, this is perhaps the most revealing detail of all, become terrified by what they themselves have unleashed. They shrink back. They ascend to the heaven of Anu. They cower like dogs. They crouch outside. The same beings who judged humanity too noisy are themselves overwhelmed by the consequence of their own correction. The mother goddess cries out in labor-like grief. How could I have ordered such evil, she laments? How could I have agreed to the destruction of my people? But agreement already happened. Regret arrives too late. That, too, is part of the coldness of the text. Remorse does not stop the water. Tears do not pull a single drowning body back to air. The council's decision continues to execute itself, while the members of that council recoil from the scale of what they chose. And below, inside the sealed vessel, Atrahasis waits. Or, in the parallel traditions, Utnapishtim waits. Ziusudra waits. The names vary across copies and centuries, but the structure remains astonishingly stable. One man warned. One household preserved. One boat sealed against a world being taken apart by water. Then after 7 days, the violence begins to recede. The boat grounds on a mountain. In Atrahasis and in later parallels, the location shifts, but the scene remains. The hatch is opened. Light enters. Air enters. Silence enters. And that silence is perhaps the true result the gods were seeking all along. Not moral restoration. Silence. The cities are gone. The clamor is gone. The bellowing land is still. Humanity, except for those within the vessel, is dead. The noise problem has been solved by nearly total absence. Atrahasis emerges and offers sacrifice. This too is preserved in multiple versions with remarkable consistency. An altar is built. Animals are slaughtered. Smoke rises. The scent reaches the gods. And then comes one of the most humiliating divine images in all ancient literature. The gods gather around the offering like flies. Like flies. Not enthroned judges receiving proper worship from a restored world, but hungry beings suddenly reminded that humanity did not only make noise. Humanity also fed the gods. Through offerings, through ritual, through continual service, human civilization sustained divine economy. Eliminate the servants and the masters, discover the cost of having no one left to serve. The flood then reveals a paradox. The earlier interventions had not fully exposed. The gods need humans. They do not merely tolerate them. They require them. Worship offering maintenance, ritual attention. These vanish when humanity vanishes. Total extinction solves the problem of noise, but it also destroys the system through which the gods themselves are maintained in relation to the world. Enlil arrives and sees that a human being has survived. His anger in the text is immediate. No man was supposed to survive. The destruction was meant to be complete. Enki answers, and again he answers with something like technical innocence. He did not warn the man directly. He warned the wall. He preserved the species without formally breaking the order. This exchange matters because it shifts the narrative. Up to this point, the problem has been how to reduce humanity enough to restore quiet. Now, the problem becomes how to allow humanity to continue at all, without ever permitting pre-flood conditions to return. The flood has proved something. Catastrophe on this scale is too great, too exhausting, too costly even for the gods who ordered it. The world cannot keep solving the human problem by resetting itself through annihilation, but neither can it return to the previous arrangement, because the previous arrangement led inevitably to the same outcome. Multiplication cities noise, divine disturbance. So a different answer is required. Not temporary devastation, not cyclical reduction, redesign. That is where the Atrahasis epic becomes perhaps most unsettling. Because after the flood, the gods do not decide never again. Not in the reassuring sense later traditions will sometimes prefer. They decide something far colder than that. They decide that if humanity is to continue, humanity must continue under altered terms. The species must be modified. Reproduction must be constrained. Mortality must do continual work. Infant life must become uncertain. Women must be divided among those who bear and those who do not. The flood, in other words, is not the end of judgment. It is the proof that judgment through total destruction is inefficient. The future will require a quieter technology of control, a permanent one. The boat then does not save humanity back into innocence. It carries humanity into a negotiated diminishment, into a world where survival will continue, but only within boundaries designed to prevent the old mistake from recurring. We do not leave the mountain restored. We leave it altered, and what comes next is not comfort. It is settlement, terms, conditions, a bargain written into bodies. The post-flood settlement is one of the most unnerving passages in the entire Mesopotamian tradition because of how controlled it feels. The storm is over. The sacrifice has been made. The surviving human line has been acknowledged. The gods have rediscovered their dependence on human offerings. All the emotional material is there for a story of reconciliation, for a story in which the near destruction of humanity becomes the occasion for mercy, renewal, and sacred closeness. But that is not what the tablets give. What they give instead is administration. If the pre-flood world failed because humanity became too numerous and too loud, then the post-flood world must be structured so that this can never happen again. Not by hoping humans will voluntarily remain small, not by trusting memory, not even by relying on periodic catastrophe alone. The correction has to be built into the human condition itself. That is what Enki proposes, and that is what the divine assembly accepts. The tablets preserve the settlement in terms that are not symbolic enough to soften. Some women will bear children. Some women will not. Fertility itself will become uneven. Built-in limitation will replace unrestricted multiplication. Biology will carry part of the burden of restraint. Then comes a darker provision still. A child-snatching force variously rendered as the Basitu demon, associated in later Mesopotamian imagination with infant death and reproductive vulnerability, is to move among human beings. Babies will not all survive. Birth itself will no longer guarantee continuation. The lap that receives a child may lose it. And then another mechanism, certain women are to be consecrated, set apart for sacred office, tabooed from childbirth, removed from the reproductive pool through institutional celibacy. High priestesses, temple women, roles that possess social and religious significance, but that also function mathematically. Fewer births, fewer lineages extending unchecked, fewer accumulations of future noise. The text does not present any of this as tragedy in the first instance. It presents it as solution. That is why it remains so difficult to sit with. Because the suffering woven into ordinary human life, infertility, infant mortality, reproductive separation, shortened span, is not framed here as random hardship. It is framed as design, deliberate post-flood design, and the settlement continues. When population rises again, disease will diminish it. Famine will diminish it. The death god will continue his work. What were once extraordinary interventions, plague, drought, hunger, will now become part of the permanent background condition of human existence. Not every moment, not every generation in equal measure, but always available, always active, always part of the structure that keeps humanity from returning to the volume of its pre-flood success. This is one of the central ideas the text refuses to let us escape. Mortality is not incidental, it is functional. Death is not merely what happens to living things. Death is part of the mechanism by which human accumulation is prevented. The same is true of disease. The same is true of reproductive loss. The same is true of the periodic fragility of harvest and body and household. These are not outside the order of things. In the logic of Atrahasis, they are the order of things after the flood. The gods do not solve the human problem by deciding to love humanity more gently. They solve it by making humanity easier to manage. And the mother goddess who once helped shape humans from clay and divine blood is not untouched by this. The surviving lines suggest grief, distance, a kind of estrangement. She has become a stranger to those she made. That phrase, or something near it, carries enormous weight. Post-flood humanity is not the same humanity she first formed. The redesign has altered the relation between creator and created. Something intimate has been broken and replaced with something procedural. This helps explain why the Mesopotamian imagination could view ordinary suffering with such terrible clarity. A child dies, a woman cannot conceive, a household weakens under illness, a generation is thinned by epidemic. These are not interpreted first as meaningless accidents, nor are they necessarily understood as punishments for specific personal sin. They are part of a larger arrangement. They are the maintenance of the bargain. Humanity may continue, but not without limits, not without loss, not without a continual trimming back of what human life left to itself would otherwise become. And because this arrangement is systemic rather than episodic, it shapes culture far beyond the flood narrative itself. It shapes what ordinary life means. It shapes what sorrow means. It shapes what expectation means. If you live in a world where infant death is high, where life is short, where disease is common, where population rarely returns to primordial abundance, then those things are not merely endured, they are narrated, explained, made part of the world's accepted architecture. The Atrahasis settlement provides that architecture. It says this is why. This is why some wombs remain empty. This is why some arms do not keep what they held. This is why death arrives early. This is why not every field yields. This is why humanity does not rise again to pre-flood numbers. The gods are maintaining the quiet. That quiet then becomes the hidden standard against which all post-flood life is measured. The world continues, yes. Cities return, yes. Agriculture returns. Worship returns. Offerings rise again. Priests serve. Kings rule. Civilization resumes. But everything resumes under new terms. Nothing resumes innocently. Nothing resumes in the expansive freedom of the first creation. The species has learned, or rather has had learning forced into it through redesign, that existence itself may continue only by being perpetually cut down to manageable scale. This is the bargain. And it is not a warm bargain. It is not covenant in the later reassuring sense. It is survival under constraint. Continued existence purchased by permanent vulnerability. Human life is allowed, but not in fullness. Human thriving is tolerated, but only within boundaries enforced by death and failure and reproductive uncertainty. We return then to the question that keeps surfacing under the text, like a shape beneath water. Was the original mistake truly ours if humanity was created to labor? And labor necessarily leads to settlement, and settlement necessarily leads to population, and population necessarily leads to sound. Then who designed the chain that produced the disaster? The tablets do not fully answer that. They let the implication hang there. The problem was in us, yes, but it may also have been in the design of what we were made to be. We were made intelligent enough to build the very conditions the gods would later condemn. We were made fertile enough to multiply. We were made social enough to produce cities. We were made lively enough to sound alive. Then when those design traits generated intolerable consequence, the creators altered the creation rather than admit the flaw at the beginning. That possibility is never developed into a formal accusation, but it never entirely disappears either. It remains in the strange tensions of the text, in Enki's partial sympathy, in the mother goddess's lament, in later fragments where survivors seem to ask, however faintly, whether all this was just. But before those questions sharpen, another narrative must be placed beside the flood, because the post-flood settlement deals with humanity as population. The myth of Adapa deals with humanity as individual possibility, and what happens there confirms that the limits imposed after the flood are not only collective, they are personal, absolute, interior to every human life. The flood makes humanity mortal in history. Adapa will show how mortality is secured in myth. Adapa begins with favor. That is what makes the story so troubling. Not hostility, not punishment. Favor. Enki chooses him. Enki grants him intelligence. Enki gives him unusual wisdom, an ear widened toward the secrets of heaven and earth, toward the destiny of the land. Adapa is elevated above ordinary humanity in precisely the area that matters most in Mesopotamian thought understanding. But the text adds its qualification immediately. He gave him wisdom. He did not give him eternal life. That line is not incidental. It is the hinge. Everything that follows turns on it. Adapa goes fishing in the sea, and a storm, specifically the south wind, overturns his boat. In anger, he curses the wind and breaks its wing. For 7 days, the wind does not blow. The cosmos notices. Of course it notices. A mortal has interfered with an atmospheric power. A human being, through the wisdom granted by Enki, has altered a function that belongs to the ordered world itself. So Anu, high god of heaven, summons him upward. And here the story becomes a chamber of thresholds. Adapa is about to move through spaces no ordinary human crosses. He will stand before the gatekeepers, Tammuz and Gazida. He will enter the presence of Anu. He will for a moment exist at the edge where human and divine almost meet. Before he goes, Enki instructs him carefully. Mourn before the gatekeepers. Say the right words. Wear the right signs of grief. They will speak well of you. And then comes the decisive warning: when food and water are set before you, do not eat. Do not drink. They will be the food and water of death. Adapa obeys. And this is where the story opens into its deepest ambiguity. When Adapa reaches heaven, he follows Enki's instructions. The gatekeepers are moved. Anu is impressed, perhaps even intrigued. He recognizes in Adapa something unusual, something dangerously close to the capacities of the gods. Why has such understanding been given to mankind? What is to be done with him? And then Anu orders that Adapa be given not death, but life. The food brought before him is the food of life. The water brought before him is the water of life. The highest God offers the mortal exactly the thing he was denied at creation, and exactly the thing Enki withheld from him from the beginning. But Adapa refuses. He refuses because he is obedient. He refuses because he trusts his creator. He refuses because Enki told him that what was being offered would kill him. And the terrible irony is that obedience becomes the mechanism by which mortality is sealed. Anu's astonishment is almost painful in the text. Why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? Now you shall not live. The moment passes. The chance closes. Adapa is sent back to earth, mortal still, and whatever explanation the later damaged lines may have contained, the narrative core is unmistakable. Humanity came near immortality and turned away from it because the God who had shaped humanity did not wish the boundary crossed. This is where the myth of Oedipus converges with Atrahasis in the most revealing way. Enki protects humanity from extinction, yes, but he also protects divine hierarchy from being breached. He preserves humans, but as humans mortal bounded temporary. He rescues the species from the flood, but he does not let the species escape the terms of the post-flood world. Wisdom can be granted. Survival can be granted. Continuity can be granted. Eternal life cannot. Why not? Because mortality is part of the settlement. Because a species that multiplies must also die. Because otherwise, the old accumulation begins again. Not through rapid birth alone this time, but through indefinite persistence. Death clears space. Death prevents buildup. Death guarantees turnover. Mortality is not simply punishment for an ancestral mistake. It is a structural answer to the problem that mistake revealed. Oedipus' refusal, then, is not merely his own loss. It becomes humanity's pattern. The nearest approach to immortality ends in return. The mortal goes up and comes back down, still subject to death. No second chance is promised. No later human is said to stand in heaven with the food of life again. The opportunity closes with him. And once you hear that story beside the post-flood settlement, the logic becomes almost unbearable in its coherence. Humanity after the flood is made reproductively limited, physically vulnerable, and absolutely mortal. Oedipus is the narrative confirmation that mortality will not be reversed through divine exception. Even the wisest human, even the most favored, even the one whose understanding troubles heaven itself, still mortal. This is also why the Epic of Gilgamesh later reads less like a heroic search than like a long, dignified refusal to accept what these older stories already settled. Gilgamesh watches Enkidu die. He realizes that he too will die. He goes in search of the flood survivor. He seeks the plant. He seeks the secret. But every stage of the story narrows toward one conclusion. Mortality is not a glitch. It is law. It is design. It is part of the arrangement established when humanity proved too capable of filling the world. Gilgamesh cannot undo that any more than Oedipus could. And that returns us again to the central discomfort. Humans were made to work. In working, we multiplied. In multiplying, we made noise. In making noise, we disturbed divine rest. And because divine rest mattered more than human flourishing, the answer became mortality distributed across the species as permanent control. The story of Oedipus sharpens that thought by reducing it from civilization to a single meal. One man stands before life. One man turns away. And in that turning, the species remains what it must remain for the gods: useful, intelligent, subordinate, and dying. It is difficult not to notice the emotional contradiction inside Enki's role. He is not simply enemy. He is not simply benefactor. He saves humanity, yes, but within limits that preserve the larger system that harms humanity. He is sympathetic without being liberating, protective without being emancipating. He keeps us alive, but keeps us within the bars of mortality. That is why these texts remain so compelling. They do not offer clean, divine psychology. They offer power intertwined with attachment, creation intertwined with management care, intertwined with control. The Creator may feel for the creation. The Creator may even preserve the creation. But the Creator still prevents it from becoming too much. And too much in these texts has many forms. Too many people, too much sound, too much continuity, too much duration, too much approach toward divine likeness. The gods will allow humanity to live. The gods will not allow humanity to live forever. That refusal is not a side note. It is the post-flood world distilled into mythic precision. Adapa obeys. Adapa returns. Adapa dies. And all of us in the logic of the clay remain inside the consequence of that refusal. But societies do not live on myth alone. They live on instruction habit, ordinary wisdom, domestic caution. If the flood and Adapa establish the great boundaries, then another text explains how those boundaries are to be lived day by day. Not in heaven, not in catastrophe, in the house, on the road, in speech, in conduct. The instructions of Shurupak take the immense cosmic lesson and press it down into human scale. And what they teach almost obsessively is restraint. The instructions of Shurupak begin in remoteness. In those days, in those far remote days, in those nights long gone beyond recall, in those years set back from ordinary memory. The text announces antiquity before it announces advice. It wants to be heard as old wisdom, as something carried from before the break in the world, from before the flood divided time into what was and what followed. Shurupak, son of Ubaratutu, speaks to his son Ziusudra, who in the flood traditions will become the survivor. A father addresses a son standing unknowingly at the edge of catastrophe. Pay attention, he says. Do not neglect what I tell you. The words of the old are precious. Already the tone is intimate, but what follows is striking for how ordinary it seems. No immediate prophecy, no grand cosmology, no declaration that the gods are preparing destruction. Instead, practical admonitions, domestic cautions, social advice, fragments of a life to be lived carefully. And yet the more one reads, the more a pattern appears. Stay small. Stay quiet. Do not make yourself excessive. Do not place yourself where conflict gathers. Do not let your life swell into the kind of visibility that draws consequence. The advice is local, but its emotional horizon is enormous. It feels like survival knowledge condensed into conduct. You should not buy a donkey that brays. Why? Because it will trouble you. Because noise enters your life through what you choose to keep near. Even the animal one acquires should not fill the air with needless sound. That detail may seem small until it is read beside a theological world in which sound itself once triggered catastrophe. You should not place your house by the public square. There is always a crowd there. Crowds mean traffic talk, dispute movement, attention. Better to remain at a remove. Better to dwell a little aside. Not absent from society, but not in its thickest noise either. You should not linger where there is quarrel. Do not become witness to it. Do not become entangled in it. Conflict magnifies presence. It makes one visible. It creates speech accusation instability. In a world governed by precarious balances, the safest life is not the most prominent life. It is the life that avoids becoming part of the loudness. Do not boast. then your words will be trusted. Boasting is more than vanity here. It is verbal enlargement of the self. It is making the self acoustically bigger than it needs to be. To boast is to occupy more air than one's rightful share. Better to be measured. Better to be heard less and believed more. That rhythm recurs again and again through the text. Restraint is not a virtue because abstract morality prefers it. Restraint is a survival practice. Do not scatter your sheep into unknown pasture. Do not overextend. Do not push beyond what you can sustain. Scale carefully. Know your bounds. Keep your world within the range of your care. Expansion is risk. Excess is risk. What cannot be managed becomes danger. Do not travel by night. Night contains uncertainty. Hidden things, misreadings. Better to move inside visible order than to test oneself against unseen terrain. The caution is practical, yes, but also psychological. Stay within intelligible limits. Do not cultivate recklessness and call it courage. Do not elevate youth too quickly. Respect elder structures. Preserve hierarchy within family and society. The elder brother is like a father. The elder sister like a mother. Obedience is framed not as humiliation, but as stabilizing form. When order weakens inside the household, noise and conflict spread outward. Again, the same principle returns from another angle. Simplicity preserves survival. Speech, especially, is treated as dangerous when unmanaged. Do not speak improperly. It will later trap you. Do not lie and then tell truth, for even your truth will be heard as lie. The sweet mouth gathers sweet herbs. The harsh mouth brings litigation. Speech is not nothing. Sound makes consequences. Words produce social weather. A culture shaped by memory of catastrophic clamor would naturally treat the mouth as instrument to be disciplined. If noise once drew divine correction, then ordinary life must train itself toward measured utterance. The text also warns against destabilizing social entanglements, relationships that complicate hierarchy, ownership, dependency, obligation. Do not buy a prostitute. Do not buy certain categories of slave. Do not involve yourself in arrangements that bring unpredictable negotiations into the center of the household. These lines are difficult to modern ears, but within the text's own logic, they fit the same pattern. Complexity multiplies friction. Friction multiplies conflict. Conflict multiplies sound. Keep life manageable. Keep it narrow enough to remain stable. And beneath all this lies a question. The text never states aloud, what if the world is dangerous? Not because gods are unpredictable, but because there are thresholds you may cross without realizing you have crossed them. Then the safest life is the least extravagant life, the least visible life, the life that does not keep pushing outward until it becomes impossible to ignore. Read that way, the instructions of Shurupak do not merely teach ethics. They teach how not to become a problem, how not to add to the conditions that once ended the world, how not to live in a way that sounds too much like the pre-flood age. The most unsettling possibility in the text, though, is this: perhaps Shurupak is not giving general wisdom at all. Perhaps he knows more than he says. Perhaps the instructions are not simply for all people everywhere, but specifically for Ziusudra, the son whose line will survive, while others perish. If so, if The text takes on an even harder edge. It becomes not public morality, but selective preservation. A father passing down the kind of restraint that keeps one family alive under conditions where most will not remain alive. The text does not explicitly say a flood is coming. It does not say you alone will endure. But it is impossible once the surrounding traditions are known not to feel that silence pressing around the advice. Stay quiet, my son. Stay careful. Do not enlarge yourself. Do not become entangled in excess. Do not draw attention, because attention can kill. That possibility changes the emotional texture of the whole composition. What first appears as prosaic fatherly counsel becomes a manual for life under divine scrutiny. Not rebellion, not heroism, not grand achievement. Survival through measured insignificance. And yet that too is part of the tragedy of these ancient texts. Humanity is not invited to greatness here, not without reservation. Greatness builds cities. Cities create density. Density creates sound. Sound invites correction. So, the wiser path, the path that can be advised from father to son across catastrophe, is smaller than ambition. Humility becomes not merely moral nobility, but acoustic caution. The flood narratives say what happened when humanity became too much. The instructions of Shura teach how not to become too much again. That is why the text was copied for centuries. Students copied it. Scribes memorized it. Households repeated it. It entered ordinary culture because it translated cosmic catastrophe into human behavior. One need not understand the divine counsel to understand that a boastful man is less trustworthy than a quiet one. One need not have read Atrahasis to know that quarrels should be avoided and houses should not be planted in the center of constant commotion. The theology survives in practical form. That is how cultures remember. Not always through formal doctrine, sometimes through the small inherited sentence that tells you where not to build your home, sometimes through the old instruction not to keep what brays too loudly, sometimes through the warning that your survival may depend on not making your life larger than it needs to be. The flood remains in the background, even when no one says its name. And after the flood, according to the longer mythic tradition, those cautions are no longer merely wise. They are necessary. Because humanity is now living under conditions specifically designed to ensure that the old abundance never fully returns. Which means the world after Shurupak's son survives is not only a world that remembers catastrophe, it is a world biologically and socially arranged, so catastrophe will not be required in the same form again. The post-flood world is not peace. It only looks like peace from far enough away. From a distance, one could mistake it for restoration. Cities rise again. Kingship returns. Offerings resume. Agriculture resumes. Families continue. The gods receive worship. The great interruption seems to settle into continuity. But the tablets preserve a different feeling beneath that surface. The world has not been healed. It has been regulated. The difference matters. To regulate is not to reconcile. To regulate is to permit continuation under control, and that control runs all the way down into the most intimate layers of human life. Some women will not bear children. Some children will not remain in the arms that receive them. Some women will belong to sacred offices that make childbirth forbidden. Disease will not be exceptional. Famine will not be unknown. Death will not come merely at the end of a full span, but throughout life as continual diminishment. In other words, the post-flood world is not simply the old world after a tragedy. It is a revised human condition. The species has been altered so that the former crisis, too many people, too much sound, too much accumulated presence, can be prevented without another universal deluge. This is why ordinary suffering carries such theological weight in Mesopotamian thought. Miscarriage, infant death, infertility epidemic, short life, all of these become legible, not as disconnected pain, but as part of one long answer to one ancient problem. The answer is brutal. The answer is effective. And the answer is never allowed to become invisible once one reads the tablets closely. This is perhaps why fragments survive that seem, however brokenly, to ask whether the arrangement is just. There is a damaged Sumerian flood fragment often associated with what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, or related traditions, in which Ziusudra appears after the flood, in a setting too broken to reconstruct fully. The lines are fractured. The clay is incomplete. But enough remains to suggest a tone of questioning. For whose sake the people we cannot restore the full speech? Honesty requires that. The text does not yield a complete protest, but the brokenness itself becomes eloquent. Someone at some point imagined the survivor asking, imagine the human being who endured the flood, not simply bowing in gratitude, but wondering about the terms of survival. Why these terms? Why this suffering? For whose sake is humanity remade into frailty? The surviving tablets do not answer those questions in full. Or if they did, once the clay no longer lets us hear the answers. But the fact that the question enters the tradition at all matters. It suggests that the ancient world did not only inherit these stories as settled comfort, it inherited them as unresolved burden. Because the burden remains obvious. Humanity's mistake, according to these texts, was not a choice against design. It was the consequence of design functioning too well. We were made to labor. We labored. We were made able to reproduce. We reproduced. We were made intelligent enough to build cities. We built cities. And once those design capacities produced unbearable consequence for the gods revised the creation and called the revision order. That is a difficult order to love. It may be an order one fears, one obeys, one survives within, but to love it without remainder would require a different emotional world than the tablets themselves seem to inhabit. Even the gods do not appear untouched by the compromise. The mother goddess laments. Enki protects but limits. Enlil is satisfied only insofar as quiet is restored. No one emerges radiant from the settlement. There is no singing reconciliation. There is only a workable arrangement. A workable arrangement is often what follows catastrophe. Not justice in full, not healing in full. Just something stable enough to continue. And that stability may be why post-flood life always carries in these traditions a probationary feeling. Humanity survives, but as though on terms that could be revoked. The gods have not ceased to possess destructive power. They have simply decided for now not to deploy it in the old total form. The memory of the flood remains as proof of capacity. The redesign of humanity remains as proof that the gods intend never to be forced into such exhaustion again. So every human generation lives beneath a double knowledge. We are still here, we are still here only under conditions. That awareness saturates the Mesopotamian imagination. It is in the myths, yes, but also in the instructional texts, the proverbs, the rituals against infant-stealing demons, the amulets, the careful household practices, the reverence towards structures that keep life measured. A culture formed by the sense that growth must remain bounded becomes a culture of vigilance. And vigilance is a kind of inherited tension. One hears it in the repeated insistence on keeping proper place. One sees it in the warnings against verbal excess. One feels it in the strange coexistence of urban civilization with an ever-present fear that civilization itself, if unchecked, becomes the source of its own danger. This is why the flood never entirely ends in these texts. Even after the waters recede, the logic of the flood continues to govern. It governs fertility, it governs mortality, it governs how one understands disease. It governs how one imagines the relation between crowd and peril noise, and correction, success, and vulnerability. The world continues in the shadow of what the flood taught. And what the flood taught, if we strip away all later consolation, is this: the gods will preserve human existence only insofar as human existence remains compatible with divine rest. That is the settlement. That is the condition. That is the coldness in the clay, because once that principle is accepted, all ordinary pain becomes readable within it. A household loses a child, the population must remain limited. A woman remains barren, not all must bear. Disease moves through a city, the death god is continuing his work. Harvest fails, numbers must be corrected. Nothing need be meaningless, but nothing need be merciful either. The arrangement makes suffering intelligible. It does not make suffering gentle, which is why one damaged question from a survivor can feel so large. For whose sake? The answer, if the rest of the tradition is allowed to speak, seems painfully clear. For the sake of divine quiet, for the sake of maintaining the conditions in which the gods may remain at ease. Humanity survives because humanity remains useful. Humanity suffers because suffering keeps usefulness from swelling into intolerable presence. It is a framework as old as writing and as unsoftened as fired clay. And because it is so old, later texts have to keep circling it, refining it, justifying it, elaborating it, sometimes perhaps hiding its roughest edges. That is especially true when we turn back to one of the earliest surviving flood accounts, the so-called Eridu Genesis, where the gaps in the tablet may preserve something almost more unsettling than a clear explanation: silence. The tablet, catalogued as CBS 10673, sits in Philadelphia in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, damaged, fragmentary, worn, a single clay witness to a story older than many of the versions that later overshadowed it. Scholars call it the Eridu Genesis, or the Sumerian flood story, though what remains of it is only part of what must once have been a larger composition. The beginning is missing, the ending is broken, and between what survives are gaps wide enough to invite unease. That incompleteness matters. It matters not only because we want what is lost, but because what is lost may have carried the very explanation later traditions worked so hard to make explicit. In this older version, the flood comes. One human survives. But the surviving lines do not preserve the now familiar complaint about human noise with the same fullness the Atrahasis epic does. At first, the tablet gives us order. The gods create humanity. they establish civilization. Kingship is set down in 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak Sipar, and Shurapak. These are not lawless places, they are sanctioned places. City foundations are acts of divine planning. The world before the flood, at least in the surviving lines, looks structured, legitimate, inhabited, according to pattern. Then the tablet breaks. A section is gone, roughly the span where motive might once have been stated. When the text resumes, the flood has already been decided. The storm winds gather. The flood sweeps over the cult centers. Ziusudra has been warned. The destruction is underway. That gap is one of the most haunting absences in ancient literature. What stood there once, did it describe the same thing? Atrahasis later preserves in detail: population growth, clamor, divine unrest. Did it state some other cause, or did it offer no extensive cause at all? We do not know, and because we do not know, the silence becomes meaningful. One possibility is simple damage. Clay broke, lines vanished, time did what time always does. Another possibility, more disturbing, is that the older tradition may have circulated in forms less interested in justification than later versions were. Perhaps the flood originally needed no elaborate rationale. Perhaps the gods decided, and that was sufficient. Perhaps later texts, uncomfortable with such raw divine power, expanded the story into a fuller causal framework. Noise, sleep population, repeated interventions, flood as last resort. If so, the Eridu Genesis preserves not less theology, but harsher theology. A world in which divine action does not need to explain itself beyond its own authority. Even the portrait of Ziusudra fits that tone. He is humble, reverent, obedient. But the surviving lines do not develop him into a moral contrast against the rest of humanity in the way later traditions sometimes do with flood survivors. He is chosen, yes, favored, yes, but not elaborately justified as uniquely righteous. He survives because warning reaches him and because he obeys. That is all the tablet clearly needs. Again, that is severe. The flood comes. One man hears, one man builds, one man survives, and the world after is different. When the storm ends, Ziusudra opens the vessel. He sees the sun god Utu. He prostrates himself. He offers sacrifice. Then An and Enlil grant him life like a god. He is placed in Dilmun, the bright place where the sun rises, a paradisal, overseas land beyond ordinary human dwelling. Why grant him immortality there? One answer is gratitude. Another is containment. A human who survives the old world and receives life like a god cannot simply be returned into the ordinary flow of post-flood society. He is removed, set apart, located elsewhere, preserved but not multiplied back into the rebuilt species. Even favor in these traditions tends to separate rather than democratize. And then the tablet ends before it can tell us more. No detailed post-flood redesign survives on this fragment. No explicit discussion of infertility, infant mortality, and imposed celibacy. No full theological settlement. Either those lines belong to another tablet now lost, or the older story did not yet carry that elaboration in the same way. If it did not, that too is revealing. It would mean that the tradition hardened over time, that later Mesopotamian thought, faced with the ordinary suffering of actual life, short spans, dead infants, unstable fertility, recurrent disease, needed a framework large enough to explain them. The flood alone explained why the world once ended. It did not yet explain why the rebuilt world remained so frail. For that atrahasis and related traditions had to go further. They had to say not only that the old world was destroyed, but that the new one was intentionally weakened. If, on the other hand, the Eridu Genesis once contained such material, and we have simply lost it, then we are living with the worst kind of archive, one that preserves the wound while withholding the rationale. Either way, the fragment forces us to reckon with something the fuller epics sometimes obscure. Catastrophe may be remembered before it is fully explained. The oldest memory may not be theory, it may just be event. Water rose, cities vanished, one family lived, everything after was less. That possibility is strengthened by the sheer reality of flooding in Mesopotamia. Rivers overflowed, levees failed, settlements disappeared, entire patterns of habitation could be broken by water. The flood story in its earliest form may have stood very near collective memory of devastation. Only later did theology spread around it, like masonry around a buried core, adding motive justice, cosmic procedure. If so, then the missing lines are not merely absent explanation. They are a space where historical trauma and mythic ordering once touched. The later texts ask, why did this happen? The older fragment may be saying only it happened. And perhaps that is why the clay remained worth copying even in damaged form. Because memory of the division mattered. Before, after, pre-flood cities, post-flood survival. The world that was and the world that came back altered. Even when explanation failed or was lost, the break remained unquestionable. That break is what all later Mesopotamian literature continues to live inside. The antediluvian age becomes a mirror and warning. The post-flood age becomes managed continuation. The old abundance becomes irrecoverable, whether because the gods forbade it or because civilization itself never again trusted such scale without fear. And once we notice how that pattern echoes beyond Sumer, how Egypt, India, and other civilizations tell related stories of human excess, divine response, near erasure, and diminished continuation, we begin to see that the question in the clay may not have belonged to Mesopotamia alone. The Mesopotamian version is perhaps the starkest in its detail, but it is not alone. Across other civilizations, other languages, other sacred landscapes, we find stories that turn on a strangely similar structure. Humanity becomes too much, or does something too much, and the gods answer with catastrophe so large it divides time itself. In Egypt, one version of that pattern appears in what we call the Book of the Heavenly Cow. The surviving inscriptions date to the New Kingdom, though the story is older. Humanity, the text says, plots against the sun god Ra. The precise nature of the offense is left vague, perhaps deliberately vague, but the response is not vague at all. Ra convenes the gods. The fierce eye goddess in the form of Sekhmet is unleashed against humankind, and she kills. She kills by day, she kills by night, she delights in the slaughter. The destruction becomes continuous, almost ungovernable. Human blood saturates the scene. The goddess enters a frenzy that threatens to become total extinction. Then Ra recoils, not before the violence, after it has begun, after it has become too much even for the god who authorized it. So he devises a means of interruption. Beer is brewed and colored red like blood. Sekhmet drinks, becomes intoxicated, and forgets her rage. The massacre ceases. Humanity survives, but only partially, and Ra withdraws. He removes himself from immediate earthly presence. A distance opens between gods and humans that did not previously exist. Again, the structure is familiar. A divine council. Humanity judged intolerable. Near extermination. A god who regrets the scale of what has been unleashed. A remnant preserved. A changed post-catastrophe relation between heaven and earth. The Egyptian narrative does not state the noise complaint in the same explicit terms as Atrahasis, but it does preserve the same emotional architecture. Human beings become a problem for divine order. Destruction is authorized. The destruction itself becomes almost too great to bear. The gods retreat into greater remove. The post-catastrophe world is not simply restored, it is reconfigured by distance. And then there is India. In Vedic and later Hindu traditions, Manu receives warning from a fish who is eventually revealed as a divine form, often associated with Vishnu as Matsya. A flood is coming. Build a boat. Preserve life. Survive what will destroy the rest. The waters rise. The world is washed clean, or nearly so. Afterwards, sacrifice is offered, and human continuation begins again. The specifics shift as they must when stories travel through cultures or emerge from parallel conditions. But the recurring logic is difficult to ignore. Warning, vessel, catastrophe, chosen survivor, continuity through remnant. A broken world renewed, but not without the memory of its breaking. Later Indian texts increasingly moralize the catastrophe, speaking of corruption, decay, the failure of the age. That sounds closer to later biblical formulations than to the Mesopotamian complaint about noise. But traditions do that. They absorb, refine, reinterpret. A raw pattern receives different ethical clothing in different civilizations, yet the core remains. Human life in excess or disorder threatens cosmic balance. The gods intervene. Only a portion survives. History restarts under changed terms. It is tempting when faced with these parallels to search for direct borrowing alone, and certainly cultural transmission occurred. Trade routes connected regions. Diplomatic archives show exchange between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Stories travel the way merchants do, adapting themselves as they cross languages and temples and courts. But even without direct borrowing, there is another reason such myths recur. Floods were real. Crowding was real. Civilization's pressure on its own environment was real. The experience of living in river civilizations meant living close to both abundance and collapse. The same waters that fed cities could drown them. The same density that made trade and culture possible could make instability devastating. The same success that allowed a civilization to grow also brought with it sound stress, hierarchy, conflict demand, and the need for ever more careful management. The myths may personify those realities as divine displeasure, because divine displeasure is one way to narrate limits. It gives intention to what otherwise feels unbearable and arbitrary. If catastrophe is divine response, then catastrophe can be remembered, interpreted, perhaps avoided. If catastrophe is meaningless, it is harder to endure. Still, the Mesopotamian version impresses a particularly uncomfortable insight. Maybe the offense was not wickedness alone, or even primarily wickedness. Maybe the offense was scale. Too many, too loud, too much. That idea has modern resonance precisely because it does not stay confined to religion. Civilizations do strain. Populations do exceed local carrying capacities. Urban density does generate its own kinds of instability and stress. Ecological systems do answer expansion with correction. One does not need to turn ancient gods into metaphors in order to notice that the stories preserve a memory of limits and of what it feels like when those limits are crossed. What is distinctive in the cuneiform record is the candor. The gods needed humans, but only in certain numbers. They wanted service, not overwhelming presence. They wanted civilization, but apparently at a scale that did not disturb the peace of those above. That tension between needing human activity and fearing its consequences may be one of the oldest written expressions of a problem that all complex societies eventually confront. How much growth can the system bear before the system begins to answer back? Ancient Mesopotamia gave that answer the voice of Enlil, the fatigue of divine sleep, and the violence of plague, drought, famine, and flood. Egypt gave it the red field of Sekhmet's slaughter and Ra's exhausted withdrawal. India gave it a fish, a warning, a boat, and a world remade through survival. Different landscapes, different gods, different sacred vocabularies. But the recurring pattern remains. Humanity does not simply perish because it is evil. Humanity approaches a threshold, and thresholds once crossed do not leave the world unchanged. That is why these stories survive. Not because they flatter us. They do not. Not because they reassure us. They do not. They survive because they remember something civilizations repeatedly learn and repeatedly struggle to articulate. Unchecked human flourishing may not feel like danger from the inside, because from the inside it looks like success. The city grows, the stores fill, the voices multiply, the land hums with productivity, and only later, perhaps from above, perhaps from outside, perhaps in hindsight, does that hum begin to sound like warning. The ancient texts do not solve that tension. They preserve it. The gods want service but not excess. Humans want life but produce accumulation. Civilization wants growth but discovers cost. The flood stories across cultures keep returning to the same severe lesson. What looks like achievement may contain the shape of correction already inside it. And once one sees that pattern in the large myths, it becomes easier to recognize how it filters downward into the smallest forms of cultural memory, into sayings, into proverbs, into the brief practical lines copied by students and repeated in households. The flood is remembered not only in epics, but in the ordinary wisdom that teaches a civilization how to live after the waters have gone. The proverbs do not announce themselves as flood theology. That is why they matter. A proverb is small enough to pass unnoticed as doctrine. It enters daily life under the sign of practicality. It tells you how to behave, how to speak, what to avoid, how to survive trouble. And because it seems ordinary, it can carry a civilization's deepest anxieties farther than formal theology sometimes can. The Sumerian proverb collections scattered across tablets from cities like Nippur and elsewhere often do exactly that. They do not retell the deluge. They do not restate the whole creation narrative. But they preserve the lesson of restraint so consistently that the larger mythic world can almost be felt behind them breathing quietly. You should not boast. Then your words will be trusted. Read simply, it is social advice. Modesty makes one credible. But read within the wider Mesopotamian frame, it becomes more than that. To boast is to enlarge yourself through speech, to make the self larger in sound than it needs to be, to turn voice into self-expansion. The correction is not merely moral, it is acoustic. Be smaller, speak less of yourself, reduce your social volume. A chattering scribe's guilt is great. Again, a practical observation. But why guilt? Why not simply annoyance? Because excessive speech is never only inefficient, it disturbs order. Even a scribe, even a member of the literate class, becomes blameworthy when he turns language into noise. No one walks a second time where a lion has eaten a man. This proverb is about memory and avoidance. A place of danger becomes marked forever. Do not return casually to what has proved deadly. In flood terms, the entire pre-catastrophe world becomes such a place. The old pattern unchecked multiplication swelling city's unmanaged sound has already shown what it leads to. One does not stroll innocently back into it. Fate is a wet bank. It can make one slip. There are few lines from the ancient world more condensed and more exact than that. A wet bank looks nearly solid until it does not. It gives way under weight. The world appears stable until suddenly it is not. Rivers overflow. Mud gives way. History changes underfoot. The proverb is environmental realism, yes, but also theology. The order you trust can become unstable without warning. Humility is wiser than certainty. The negligent one ruins his family. Negligence here is never merely personal failure. In a precarious world, one person's carelessness spreads outward. The household is vulnerable. The city is vulnerable. Civilization itself is vulnerable. What one neglects can become what undoes many. You should not work using only your eyes. You will not multiply your possessions using only your mouth. Here again, the word multiply carries a quiet resonance. Growth does not come from empty speech. It comes from labor. And yet labor itself, as the great myths warn, can become too successful. The proverb solves that tension by praising action over verbal inflation, while the surrounding culture teaches that even successful action must remain bounded. Work, yes. Boast, no. Grow, yes, but not into excess. The line between proper prosperity and dangerous abundance remains thin. The strong one can escape anyone's hand except divine hands. Strength has limits. Human capacity has limits. There are powers above contest. That lesson echoes the flood narratives with almost painful clarity. No city wall, no family line, no kingly force protected the pre-flood world when the gods decided otherwise. Human power matters only within the larger permission of what surrounds it. And then there are the sayings about speech more directly. Tell a lie and then tell the truth. It will be considered a lie. Once sound has been corrupted, even truth loses force. Reputation shapes hearing. A people that has once generated the wrong kind of noise may discover that later claims of order are not easily believed. On the smallest scale, the proverb teaches personal honesty. On the largest scale, it mirrors the post-flood condition humanity lives under suspicion of its own tendencies. A loving heart maintains a family A hateful heart destroys a family. It would be easy to treat that as generic wisdom, and it is. But generic wisdom is where cultures store what they most need not to forget. Internal disorder becomes external vulnerability. In a world where catastrophe can thin populations and unmake systems, survival depends not only on strength, but on the emotional discipline that prevents households from splitting apart under pressure. Nothing is to be valued, but life should be sweet. That line, preserved also in the orbit of the instructions of Shuruppak, is almost unbearable in its tenderness. It accepts mortality. It accepts transience. It accepts that possessions do not hold. Yet it insists softly that life, brief though it is, should still be sweet. In a post-flood world structured by limitation, sweetness becomes more precious, precisely because duration is not guaranteed. The Proverbs do not rebel against mortality. They teach how to live inside it without unnecessary enlargement. Do not draw up water you cannot reach. It will make you weak. Do not overextend. Do not reach into what exceeds your grasp. The line is practical, but like so much in this literature, it also feels metaphysical. There are distances you are not meant to force, capacities you are not meant to imitate, thresholds you are not meant to cross. Adapa reaches heaven, but not immortality. Gilgamesh reaches the plant, but not permanent possession. Humanity reaches civilization, but not limitless expansion. The proverb condenses all of that into one image: water, beyond reach, weakens the one who strains for it. What emerges from these collections is not joyless repression. It is culture after catastrophe, teaching itself proportion. How much speech is too much? How much pride is too much? How much ambition? How much quarrel? How much proximity to the crowd? How much trust in stability? The answer in every case tends toward the same direction. Less. Less is safer. Less is more durable. Less is what survives. That is why the Proverbs matter so much. They show what flood memory looks like after it has left the epic and entered ordinary life. The grand narrative becomes daily reflex. One need not mention Enlil to know that loudness brings trouble. One need not name the flood to avoid building too close to public tumult. One need not recite Atrahasis to teach a child that boasting weakens trust and quarrel entangles the careless. A civilization remembers catastrophe by shaping habits. The proverb is one of the smallest tools by which that shaping occurs. And because these sayings were copied by students, recited by scribes, repeated in households, they outlived the kingdoms that first pressed them into clay. Their practical form gave them durability. Their simplicity made them portable. Their caution kept them relevant. Know your limits. Respect boundaries. Do not let yourself swell into trouble. These are not random moral preferences. They are survival instructions grown ordinary through repetition. And they prepare us finally to return to the tablet in the cold vault, to the clay that began with the complaint of divine sleeplessness, to the question that remains after all the flood stories, all the instructions, all the proverbs, all the settled suffering of the post-flood world have spoken. Was humanity punished for wrongdoing, or for being too completely what it had been made to be? The tablet is still cold. It was cold when the scholar first held it in the museum basement. It is cold now in imagination, in archive, in storage, in the mind's attempt to return to where the whole inquiry began. Be M78941, broken corner, fired clay, wedge marks impressed by hands long gone. A surface patient enough to wait 4,000 years before anyone asked it the right question again. And the question remains as disturbing now as it must have been when the first modern readers realized what the text was actually saying. Not that humanity stole something forbidden, not that humanity rebelled in open war, not that humanity ruined paradise through disobedience, but that humanity multiplied, lived, and made the world loud with its own successful existence. The gods could not sleep. Therefore, the gods acted. Everything in the script of these ancient records keeps returning to that same center. The first creation is practical. Humans are made to relieve divine labor. The first success is real humans perform the assigned work. The first problem emerges from that success itself. Labor leads to civilization. Civilization leads to population. Population leads to noise, and noise rises until divine rest is disturbed. Then come the corrections. Plague, drought, famine, each one intended not to destroy humanity entirely at first, but to reduce it, to make it smaller, to make it quieter, to trim back a species that had become too effective at being what it was designed to be. And when reduction failed because humans survived, adapted, rebuilt, returned, the flood followed. Not as spontaneous fury, but as final solution. Not because the gods suddenly discovered evil, but because the old methods had not solved the original problem. After the flood, the settlement is colder still. Humanity may continue, but only under limits now written into flesh and future. Some women will not conceive. Some children will not survive. Some women will be consecrated away from reproduction. Disease and famine and death will continue their work. Mortality will remain absolute. Oedipus will come close to eternal life and turn from it. Gilgamesh will search and fail. The species will endure, but only as a species that dies. That is the arrangement. That is the redesign. That is the answer the tablets preserve to the question of why human life is so vulnerable even after civilization begins again. And once one sees that answer, another question refuses to leave. Was this just the texts do not settle it? They preserve signs of discomfort around it. The mother goddess laments what was done to her creations. Enki protects humanity, though never fully enough to free it. Broken fragments suggest survivors may have asked why this had to be so. The instructions of Shuruppak teach quietness and restraint, but beneath their calm, practical wisdom lies the knowledge that survival depends on never again becoming too large, too loud, too visible. The Proverbs remember the same lesson in miniature. Do not boast. Do not place yourself in quarrel. Do not overreach. Do not trust unstable ground. Keep life sweet, but keep it measured. Stay within the bounds that let a civilization continue without calling down correction. And perhaps that is the deepest unease in the clay. The correction never comes because humanity fails to be human. It comes because humanity succeeds at being human beyond what the gods can comfortably tolerate. We work, we multiply, we build, we speak, we gather, we fill the land, and then the land becomes too full of us. What does that say about the gods who made us? The tablets do not tell us to stop asking. They simply refuse to answer in a comforting voice. They preserve the structure of the problem and leave us inside it. If the designers made beings whose natural flourishing would eventually become intolerable, then the flaw was not only in the creation, it may also have been in the design. Yet the designers correct the created not themselves. They narrow us. They mortalize us. They turn suffering into maintenance. They call the result order. This is not mythology in the shallow sense of stories meant only to entertain or console. It is closer to memory hardened into thought. Memory of catastrophe, memory of limits, memory of civilizations, learning that growth contains danger, that abundance contains strain, that sound itself may become a sign of approaching correction. Whether one believes the gods of these tablets literally acted is not the only question. The deeper question may be why some of the oldest written records of civilization chose to imagine human suffering this way at all. Why they linked mortality, infant loss, disease, and disaster not to moral wickedness in the narrow sense, but to success beyond sustainable measure. Perhaps because they knew what river civilizations know, that prosperity can become pressure, that cities can become too dense, that flourishing can outrun balance, that the sound of life gathering at scale can change from music into warning before those inside it realize anything is wrong. The cuneiform tablets do not flatten that into a slogan. They let it remain hard. They let it remain unresolved. They let the clay hold both the documentation and the discomfort. Humanity was made to serve. Humanity served too well. Humanity was corrected. The correction never fully ended. That is the memory. And perhaps memory here is enough. Perhaps that is the function of these stories. Not to comfort, but to keep alive an awareness of limits. To remind later generations that civilizations can mistake expansion for immunity. That success can generate its own peril. That a world loud with accomplishment may already be nearing a threshold it cannot hear itself approaching. The ancient scribes pressed these signs into clay because they believed the pattern mattered. They fired the tablets because they believed memory should outlast the generation that first learned the lesson. They copied the instructions, the flood stories, the proverbs, the laments, because forgetting would be dangerous. And now the clay remains. The British Museum tablet remains. The Philadelphia fragment remains. The scattered echoes in Egypt and India remain. The instructions remain. The proverbs remain. The question remains. If humanity's first mistake was thriving too successfully, what does that mean for any civilization that still imagines endless growth as simple progress? What does it mean for any culture that hears noise as proof of life, but never asks when life at scale begins to sound from somewhere else, like intolerable clamor? What does it mean that some of the oldest written minds we can still hear did not imagine our greatest danger as weakness, but as unchecked success? The tablets do not answer for us. They remember for us. They remember that there was a flood. They remember that the gods regretted and yet did not undo what they had done. They remember that survival came with terms. They remember that mortality itself may have been part of the settlement. They remember that wisdom without eternal life is still limitation. They remember that fathers taught sons to stay small, to stay careful, to stay quiet. They remember that whole civilizations built practical ethics out of a fear that excess invites correction. And after 4,000 years, the clay still holds the same disturbing possibility. Humanity's oldest written mistake was not that we failed to become what we were meant to be. It was that we became it too completely. We lived. We multiplied. We made the world loud with living. And for that, according to the tablets, we were nearly erased. Not fully erased. Not quite. Mercy remained, but only a narrow mercy. A mercy that preserved us in diminished form. A mercy that kept us mortal, vulnerable, bounded, manageable. The clay remembers all of that. The clay does not soften it. The clay does not apologize. It simply keeps the marks. And somewhere in those marks, still waiting in basement cold and archive silence, the ancient question remains exactly where it was first pressed. What if the punishment was never for doing wrong? What if it was for doing exactly what we were made to do, and doing it too well?